All right, buckle up for a deep dive.
Right.
This one might just flip the script on how you usually think about marriage and divorce.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is, but also super fascinating. We're looking at these topics, marriage and divorce, but through this unique lens, the spiritual perspective.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Whose perspective are we talking about?
Allan Kardec, specifically his book, The Gospel According to the Spiritist.
Oh, Kardec. Yeah, he's the 19th century French thinker, right? The one who basically laid out all the principles of Spiritism.
That's him. And he wasn't just into repeating the usual religious stuff. He wanted to go deeper, wanted to understand the spiritual side of our actions and relationships, really get into the soul stuff.
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to get caught up in the rules and forget about the deeper meaning behind things.
Exactly. And that's what I love about Kardec. When it comes to marriage, he's not just talking about the legal side of things, the contracts and all that.
Right.
He's talking about the soul connections, the spiritual implications.
So what's his take on marriage then?
Well, one of the things that really jumped out at me is this idea that marriage is actually governed by two separate laws. There's the divine law of love, which is eternal, never changes.
Okay.
And then there are the human laws, the ones about social contracts. Those are way more fluid.
Yeah.
They adapt and change over time.
Oh, yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, think about it. Even today, what makes a marriage legal is totally different depending on where you are in the world, right?
Exactly. In some places, you got to have a religious ceremony. Others, it's all civil. And some, you need both.
Right. So many variations.
Yeah, and Kardec's point is that while all those human laws are changing all the time,
Yeah.
evolving with culture and stuff, that fundamental law of love, as he defined it, that stays the same.
So it's like there's this constant tension between the divine and the human when it comes to marriage.
Exactly. It's that potential clash that he really wants us to think about. So, if someone's thinking about getting married, what should they be considering from Kardec's point of view? What matters most?
Well, Kardec was pretty critical of marriages that were just based on material interests, wealth, social status, family pressure, that kind of thing.
Really? So he's saying love should be the main reason.
Yeah, pretty much. He believed that those other unions, the ones without that genuine affection, they often just lack what's needed for a truly fulfilling and lasting bond.
Huh. That kind of feels radical even today. Love is the most important thing, not practicality or security.
I know, right? But for Kardec, it was all about that deeper connection. He felt that when the human motivations for marriage clashed with that law of love, things could get pretty messy.
You mean unhappy relationships, divorce?
Exactly. Think about all the relationships that struggle because deep down there wasn't really that genuine connection from the start. Maybe there were other reasons for getting married, but not love.
I never thought about it like that.
It makes you wonder, right? What are we really basing our relationships on?
Definitely. And I guess that brings us to the big D word, divorce. This is where Kardec's perspective gets super interesting.
Oh, I bet. So how does he view divorce? Is it this big moral failure? A sin?
Surprisingly, no. He actually saw it as a necessary reform, especially in a world where people often just rush into marriage without even thinking about that law of love we were talking about.
So he's not against it, even though we usually think of divorce as a bad thing,
Right. And Kardec even goes so far as to say that divorce isn't actually contrary to God's law.
Wow, really?
Because in his view, a lot of the time, that law of love wasn't really considered in the first place. He's suggesting that maybe some of those unions, they just shouldn't have happened if love wasn't the foundation.
That's a really different way of looking at it. So he's saying if a marriage is already broken, spiritually, there's no love there. What's the point of forcing it to continue? Just for appearances.
Exactly. And he points out that even the church itself, throughout history, they've granted divorces under certain circumstances. So even religious institutions, they've acknowledged that sometimes separation is necessary.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially when that essential ingredient, love, just isn't there. And this reminds me of that passage in the Bible, where Jesus seemingly allows for divorce because of the, the hardness of hearts.
Oh, yeah. I always found that a bit confusing.
Me too. But Kardec has this interesting take on it. He sees it as Jesus acknowledging human imperfection. In a perfect world, maybe divorce wouldn't even be necessary.
Right.
But in reality, people make choices based on all sorts of things, not just love.
Right.
And those choices, well, sometimes they lead to relationships that just aren't meant to last.
It's like he's saying we're not quite there yet, evolutionarily speaking. We haven't quite mastered that whole love conquers all thing.
Yeah. I guess that's true. It makes you wonder, though, if we're evolving spiritually, does that mean the need for divorce would eventually just disappear? Like, as we learn to prioritize love more and more?
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Like, maybe the existence of divorce itself is just a reflection of where we are right now on that journey.
That's deep. Okay, so we've talked about love as the foundation and the complexities of divorce. But what about adultery? That seems like a pretty clear violation of that law of love, right?
Adultery. Yeah, that's a tricky one. But, with Kardec, it's never a simple answer. He's got a nuanced perspective on adultery, too, and trust me, it's fascinating.
Ooh, okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
Well, we'll have to save that for part 2 because adultery deserves its own deep dive. So adultery, it's definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, last time we were talking about how Kardec saw divorce as this kind of necessary reform, especially when, love wasn't always the main reason for getting married in the first place. But adultery, that's got to be a whole other ball game, right?
It is. But as you might guess, Kardec's view on adultery isn't just a simple, this is wrong, period. He recognizes it's a betrayal, a violation of trust, for sure, but he digs deeper.
Deeper how? Isn't adultery pretty much universally seen as, serious sin?
Yeah, most religions see it that way. But Kardec, he was all about looking beyond the surface. So he argued that to really get the spiritual implications, you got to understand the motivations. Why did this happen?
So it's not just a blanket judgment.
Nope. He even goes so far as to distinguish between adultery that's just driven by selfish desires versus adultery that, well, it might come from a genuine search for love, especially if the marriage itself is already loveless.
Wait, hold on. Is he saying there are different types of adultery and some are, I don't know, less bad than others? Spiritually speaking,
That's exactly what he's saying, which is pretty bold, I know. But it makes sense when you think about it from his perspective. Imagine someone trapped in a marriage, no love, no affection, just emptiness.
Yeah, I can see how that would be rough.
Right. And then they meet someone else. Someone who offers that emotional connection they've been craving.
But doesn't that kind of justify cheating?
Ugh.
If you're unhappy, just go find someone else.
No, he's definitely not condoning adultery. It's more about urging us to understand that human emotions and the reasons we do things are complicated. Adultery is still a breach of trust, absolutely. But the spiritual consequences, well, they might vary depending on the person's intentions.
Okay, so someone cheating just for the thrill of it, that's different from someone who, feels genuinely unloved and is seeking connection elsewhere.
Exactly. Kardec believed that adultery driven by, purely base desires, lust, revenge, that reflects a lower level of spiritual development. And it would have negative consequences.
Yeah.
But when it comes from that genuine yearning for love in a situation where it's already absent, that's where things get more nuanced.
It's like he's saying, ideally, no one would even be in a situation where adultery is an option.
Right.
But we're human. We mess up. And sometimes we end up in relationships that just don't align with, our spiritual path.
You put it perfectly. And that's where Kardec's focus on moral development comes in. He believed that as we grow spiritually, the more in tune we are with that law of love, the less likely we are to do things that cause harm. Actions that break those sacred bonds.
So in a perfect world, in a truly evolved society where everyone's acting from love, adultery wouldn't even be a thing.
Precisely. And it circles back to his view on divorce. It's needed because, well, we're not at that ideal state yet.
I'm starting to see how it all connects, but I've still got this one big question nagging at me. What about Jesus' stance on adultery? It always seemed pretty harsh, especially the part about, forbidding remarriage after divorce, especially for women. How does Kardec reconcile that with this more nuanced view?
It's a great point, and Kardec addresses it head on. Remember, he always emphasized the importance of context, like the historical and social stuff going on when these teachings came about.
Right.
And in Jesus' time, adultery, that was a big deal, punishable by death even, especially for women.
Wow. Okay, so the stakes were a lot higher back then.
Way higher.
Right.
So by saying no to remarriage, Jesus was actually offering protection. A pragmatic solution, safeguarding people from those harsh consequences.
Whoa. So it wasn't about being judgmental. It was about protecting vulnerable people.
Exactly. It's a totally different way of looking at it.
Yeah, it never even crossed my mind that those pronouncements, they might have been about harm reduction.
Right. It's a perfect example of how Kardec encourages us to look beyond the literal words, to see the deeper spirit behind those teachings, the underlying principles, love, compassion, understanding.
So we shouldn't get hung up on the exact rules, but try to understand the bigger picture, the heart of the matter.
Exactly. And that's why Kardec's perspective is so relevant today, even centuries later. He challenges us to look at our own motivations, to examine our relationships, and to move past rigid judgments, toward a more compassionate, nuanced understanding of, well, just being human.
This is blowing my mind. I feel like I'm seeing marriage, divorce, even adultery itself through this whole new lens. It's like everything's shifting.
I love that. And there's still more to explore. Kardec doesn't stop at just analyzing these issues. He introduces this deeper concept, spiritual affinity.
Spiritual affinity.
Yeah, it's about going beyond the legal stuff, even the emotional stuff. This idea gets into the core of why we're drawn to certain people.
Okay, that sounds fascinating. Like, it could be the key to, I don't know, really figuring out what makes a relationship last.
It might be, and that's exactly what we'll dive into in part 3. We'll explore what Kardec meant by this spiritual affinity, how it connects to that law of love, and what it could mean for finding real, lasting fulfillment in our relationships.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into all things marriage and divorce. The Kardec edition.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. We've covered a lot of ground. We talked about love, the divine kind as the real foundation for it all.
Yeah, that law of love. Yeah. Such a powerful idea.
Totally. And then we got into the complexities of divorce and even adultery. But now we're getting to what feels like the core, this idea of spiritual affinity. It's like the missing piece of the puzzle,
It might be. Kardec definitely believed it was key. And, in a lot of ways, it ties together everything we've talked about so far. He believed that real love, the kind that can go the distance, the kind that evolves, well, it's got to be rooted in something deeper, something more than just, physical attraction or fleeting feelings.
Deeper, like soul stuff?
Exactly. He called it spiritual affinity, a connection between souls that goes beyond the physical, like it transcends the material world.
Okay, so we're talking soulmates here, like finding the one.
Not necessarily the one, but definitely on the same wavelength, spiritually speaking. It's more about finding someone who resonates with you on a deep level, someone who shares your values, your goals, even your spiritual aspirations. Like you're both on a similar path, and you recognize each other along the way.
I love that. It's not about finding that one perfect person, but finding someone who gets you, who's on that same journey.
Exactly. And Kardec believed that kind of connection is essential for a relationship to really thrive. Those marriages based on like social pressure or just convenience, he thought they were much more likely to fall apart because they lacked that deeper spiritual bond.
That makes so much sense. It goes back to what we were saying before about how he was so against those marriages based solely on material stuff. Love was the foundation, but now it seems like this spiritual affinity, that's what really strengthens that foundation.
You got it. It was the key to a truly lasting bond for him. And this concept, it has huge implications for how we view not just marriage, but also divorce.
Okay, I got to ask, how does spiritual affinity change how we think about divorce?
Well, let's think about it. If we're saying that true love needs this deep spiritual connection to really work, what happens when it's just not there?
I guess the relationship is kind of doomed from the start, or at least it's going to be shaky.
Right. So in those cases, divorce, it might not be a failure. It might be the natural outcome, maybe even a positive step, because it allows both people to find partners who are truly aligned with them, on that soul level.
So instead of looking at divorce as this sad ending, it could be a new beginning, a chance to find a love that actually makes sense for your soul.
Exactly. And this way of looking at it, it offers so much compassion and understanding. It recognizes that relationships change. And sometimes those changes mean going in different directions.
This whole conversation has really got me reevaluating my own ideas about relationships. Like what really matters. It's not just about checking off boxes on a list, It's about finding someone who truly sees you, who connects with you on that deep level.
And it all comes back to that law of love, that guiding principle that should be shaping our choices, according to Kardec. Choosing to end a relationship that doesn't have that spiritual connection, well, it can be an act of love for both people involved.
It's like recognizing that sometimes letting go is actually the kindest thing to do.
Exactly. And this brings us full circle to the power of Kardec's perspective. He pushes us to look beyond the rigid rules and structures we create, to prioritize spiritual growth, and to really honor the well-being of everyone involved.
So where do we go from here? What does all this mean for us, trying to navigate love and relationships in, the crazy world of the 21st century?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think Kardec gives us a lot to consider. Maybe it's a reminder to be more mindful, to really think about what we're looking for in a partner, and to be open to the possibility that, well, true love might be rooted in something way deeper than we initially realize.
It's like he's saying, go beyond those surface level things. Look for connections that truly feed your soul.
Exactly. And I think that's a message worth holding on to, no matter where you are in your own journey, whether you're in a relationship, searching for one, or just thinking about what love really means.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new perspective now on love, marriage, even divorce.
I'm so glad to hear that. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. What if that law of love that we've been talking about, what if it truly guided every single choice we made in our relationships? Would we even need all the legal stuff, all those rules around marriage and divorce? How much would those structures even matter if love was really at the center?
Wow. That's a powerful question. And it really speaks to how relevant Kardec's work still is today. He challenged us to question everything, to think critically about the systems we create, and to consider how we can make those systems better reflect, the deepest desires of our hearts.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep loving.